that when last year in June at the Sherwood Festival, we invited Jason Moore, one of the theorists of this notion of capitalocene, to talk about these and other notions he's working on in Padua. We couldn't expect that 1 year after we would be here in a climate camp with people from all over Europe, after 2 climate strikes, adding to a 3rd one, and with the climate justice movements in Europe being as powerful as it is now. So this is already something that we should take into account, because we are now talking in a very political sense. So a first way to approach the idea of political ecology is that this is no longer just a theoretical discussion. It is directly linked to strategy and activism on the ground. I think that's a good point to start. About the definition of political ecology, of course, I'm just proposing, giving you the one I think is the best, is one of the possible definition. It's simply that the ecological crisis, or ecology in itself, doesn't really speak directly or immediately. Like, to make sense of what the ecological crisis is, we need to consider the filter which actually mediates between society and the biosphere. And being a Marxist, sorry, this is a spoiler, but yeah, okay, I am, let's be honest from the beginning, I do believe that this filter is the mode of production. Ecological limits are not there objectively, they are there because we have certain needs and we have certain goods to satisfy those needs and certain way to produce those goods. If we change either the goods or the needs or the way of producing them, then what seems to be an ecological limit within one mode of production can actually turn out not to be a limit at all. So this is another way to say that if we engage with limits politically, we actually change the game, and this is exactly what the ecological movements and climate justice and the environmental justice are doing all around the world, not just in Europe. And let me just say that I know that this is a good phase for climate justice movements in Europe. Not necessarily this is the case everywhere, and especially in Latin America, we need to say that there are assassinations and they are facing a huge repression. So let's not forget that we are not just the center of the world, and to be honest, we are not at all. But it's also true that we are here, and so we discuss our strategies, and maybe also a way to support comrades in different places. Quite quickly, a few words on the Anthropocene. I think a good starting point to frame the issue is to say that there are, in my opinion, 3 registers to understand what the climate debate is about. And there is the first register is about the effects of climate change or the environmental crisis, and then it's what basically you are familiar with in mainstream media. So the debate is about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, the 6th mass extinction, acidification of ocean, and other problems you have. And normally they are put in a list. So like, you have climate change and a list of bad effects. And then in this case, the discrimination, the political line, dividing line is between people saying, no, this is not at all due to human action. So there's no anthropogenic climate change, there's just climate change. So let's call them the naysayers, the negationist camp. And on the other side, there is the scientific community and one may say common sense, although right now it's probably too optimistic to call it common sense, because we have seen in the last conference of the parties in Katowice, the 24th, that the negationist faction within the United Nations is now quite powerful, because it includes the United States, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other not so irrelevant countries. But in any case, so the first register is about, does climate change exist or not? And I don't want to talk about that here, because I suppose that if we are here, we believe climate change is real, and we should do something about that. So if we want to talk about epistemology, I think it's an interesting talk, but I don't want to talk about that now. The Anthropocene actually comes into play in the second register, which is the register about the causes. Once we know that climate change exists, and there is human implication in that. Who should be considered responsible for these bad effects? So one answer would be the species as a whole, so humans, and hence Anthropocene, the geological era marked by human action, if we want a bad translation, but I'm not versed in Greek, so whatever. But that's the main point. Or you can say, and here I'm making a direct reference to the work of historian Stefania Barca, she says climate change is actually the most fitting example of global inequality in the 21st century. So you see, on the one hand, you have unity based on species, which basically hides class inequality. And if you, on the other hand, starts from class inequality, you see that the species is not a whole, it's not a monolith. I do think it's much better to talk about, and so in this case you can have, well, there have been many names proposed to call this idea of climate change being the effect, being caused by social inequality. And you can have the Capitalocene, Jason W. Moore, but also Andreas Malm and Donna Haraway. Other names, I mean, I don't think it's a very nice debate from a nominalistic point of view, because Anthropocene is a bad word, Capitalocene is even worse, plantation scene is, well, too much. And Cthulhucene also, Donna Haraway. I mean, like, you know, all this can be an interesting theoretical debate, but I don't think it's politically very relevant. The last point of what I want to say now, basically, is that the Anthropocene option has been actually translated into a technocratic style of governance, okay, which has been operational since the Kyoto Protocol 1997 in policy terms, and in theoretical terms, at least since 1987, when they started to debate about the notion of sustainable development. Okay? The main idea is what has been considered until the 80s a problem for capital accumulation, which is the environmental crisis, can be now turned into a driver of further accumulation. Okay? So basically the environmental crisis would be a normal limit to capital expansion, like, you know, just like in Marxist theory, social limits before. Okay, this is the idea. There are, of course, conditions of possibility to this idea to exist, but I mean, like, it would be too long, and I don't want, and I know that Alex will talk a lot about this. So why this idea, which is called the green economy, cannot work in theory and in practice. So I conclude my intervention here by saying that this political option, the main object was to basically innovate the industrial structure of advanced capitalist society to make it more immaterial. So on the one hand, you would have innovation through process innovation, so relative decoupling. You would have, like, you know, more value produced while reducing the rate of expansion of material throughput, which is, like, you know, the flows of materials and energy which traverses the economic system. Or you could have a transformation of this industrial model through innovation through products, which would make it completely immaterial, and in this case you would have absolute decoupling, which means you do more commodities, in this case services, by using less material. As I said, Alex will explain why this cannot happen, but I want to tell you that after last December in Katowice COP24, this is officially collapsed. So it has been official policy from '97 to the Paris Agreement, and now all the states and pieces of societies that supported that wager, because it was a bet, like, you know, nobody knew if it could work or not, but there was a large consensus that this was worth a try, this idea. I think 2018 marked the end of this dream, of this wager. And I think what we see today as new movements, for example, the Fridays for Future, they clearly, in my opinion, from a social composition perspective, they were those NGOs and other groups from civil society which have supported the United Nations process, believing that it could be good. Okay? And after a while, they realized this cannot work. And so now they are back to the squares. This is a good moment, in my opinion, to be a climate justice activist, and I hope it will be even better at the end of this climate camp. Thank you.